Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
The call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was finishing a presentation for a client who had no idea that the home office behind me used to be a one-room apartment with a view of a parking lot. My mother's voice was shaky and sweet, the kind she used when she wanted something but pretended she didn't. "Honey," she said, "your father's been in and out of the hospital again. The bills are piling up. Maybe you could help a little." I paused just long enough to make it sound like I was thinking, then said, calm as ice, "I'm sure my brother, the lawyer, can afford it." The silence that followed was thick and sour, like the air before a thunderstorm. I hung up before she could find words to twist. Then I sat back in my chair and stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, and for the first time in a long while, I let myself remember how it all started, the day I realized I wasn't the golden child, just the leftover one. I was 17, standing in our kitchen that smelled like burned toast and cheap coffee, clutching a brochure for the Rhode Island School of Design. I wanted to study art, design, photography, maybe film someday. My mother took one look at the tuition number and laughed, not kindly but nervously, the way someone laughs when they're about to crush your dream but hope you won't make it awkward. "Honey," she said, "college is expensive. We can't afford something like that right now." My father, sitting at the table with his newspaper, added without looking up, "You're creative, sure, but maybe find something practical. We just don't have the money." I nodded, pretending to understand, pretending that no money meant something universal and fair. I told myself it wasn't personal, that we were all struggling. Then, 3 months later, my brother Jake got his acceptance letter to Columbia Law. My parents threw a dinner party. They opened champagne. My father made a toast, talking about sacrifice and family pride. "We'll make it work," he said. "When it's your child's future, you find a way." And I sat there, smiling like a guest at my own funeral, realizing that no money had always been a selective condition, a scarcity that applied only when it came to me. After that night, I stopped asking. I still remember how the kitchen lights reflected off my brother's new laptop, the one they said was an investment. My own college dreams shrank down to something that could fit inside a used notebook. I applied to a community college 3 states away because it was the only one that didn't require parental signatures. My mother cried when I told her I was leaving, but not for the reason you might think. "You'll be so far," she said, like distance was the tragedy, not the choice that caused it. The day I left, my brother helped me carry a single suitcase to the bus stop. He hugged me with the practiced sympathy of someone who's never known what it's like to be the disappointment. "You'll figure it out," he said, the words smooth and effortless, like he was passing me a curse disguised as advice. I smiled back and said, "I always do." Then I turned and didn't look back. The apartment I found was small enough that I could touch the stove from my bed if I stretched. The paint peeled near the ceiling, the radiator clanged like an old drunk trying to get attention, and the neighbors upstairs fought about money almost every night. But it was mine. Every ugly inch of it was earned, and for the first time, I didn't owe anyone an explanation. I worked days at a cafe and nights cleaning offices, saving every dollar I could. My shoes wore thin, my hands cracked from detergent, and there were nights I fell asleep at my desk with half-finished sketches stuck to my cheek. But I didn't complain. You don't complain when you're building something that's supposed to last. I used to imagine what my parents were doing in their big house with its new kitchen and renovated bathroom. Probably hosting another dinner to celebrate Jake's internships, his new suits, his growing legend. I'd picture my mother saying, "He's so driven," while my name sat unspoken in her throat like something too small to mention. I learned to stop expecting updates, calls, or congratulations. The silence became a kind of background noise, annoying at first, then oddly comforting. One night, while wiping tables at the cafe, I overheard 2 customers talking about a scholarship program that didn't require financial backing from parents. That night, after my shift, I sat in my drafty apartment and filled out the application online, my fingers trembling from fatigue and hope. I didn't tell anyone, not even the one friend I had at work. When I mailed the packet the next morning, I remember whispering to myself, "This one's mine." Weeks passed. Bills stacked up. The scholarship slipped into the fog of half-forgotten attempts. Then, one afternoon, I opened my mailbox to find a thick envelope. Inside was a letter that began with the word "Congratulations." I read it 3 times before I believed it. A full scholarship to study design at a state university. No loans, no signatures, no parental approval. Just me, finally getting what I'd earned. I sat on the floor of my apartment and cried, not from joy, but from something heavier. Because I knew this victory didn't belong to the girl my parents had raised, it belonged to the one they'd left behind. And as I folded that letter back into its envelope, I felt something click into place inside me, a decision as sharp as glass. I would go. I would make something of myself. But I would never owe them another word, another favor, another ounce of loyalty. If they ever came knocking, I'd be ready with the same line they'd once given me, delivered with a smile sharp enough to cut. There's just no money. When the scholarship letter stopped feeling like a prank and started to feel like a key I had found in my own pocket, I packed the same scuffed suitcase, took a bus that stopped at every town with a diner and a half-lit motel sign, and moved into a university dorm that smelled like detergent and new beginnings, where I learned quickly that having tuition covered is a blessing that still leaves 1,000 small costs to fight through, so I worked the morning shift at a cafe off campus, took evening classes in typography and user experience, and spent most nights hunched over the campus lab's aging iMacs teaching myself the patience you need when a cursor refuses to obey and a deadline does not care that you have been awake for 18 hours already. The girls down the hall talked about weekend trips their parents were funding and internships their uncles arranged with film studios I had only seen in end credits, and I nodded and smiled because envy is a petty look on anyone, then went back to Craigslist posts from small businesses begging for a logo fast and cheap, which I took not because I loved the phrase, but because learning how to make something under pressure, for people who may not know what they want until they see it, is a better education than any lecture on the grid. I remember the first time I walked into a print shop with a handful of proofs for a barber who paid me in cash and a free haircut I never used, how the paper smell mixed with warm toner and felt like a future I could touch, and how the owner, a bored man with kind eyes, showed me how to calibrate color because skin tones were coming out too cold, a small kindness that made me think about how generosity often shows up in places where prestige does not, and how the reverse is just as true. In class, I kept my head down and my grades high, not out of fear, but out of a stubborn loyalty to the version of me who had counted tips in that one-room apartment and promised that if the world would not open a door, we would draw one, cut it out, and walk through anyway. My parents called once in a while, mostly to narrate my brother's ascent, and I listened the way you listen to a podcast you did not choose on a long drive, with polite interest and a private clock running in the back of your mind, because there were fonts to test, comps to revise, and invoices to send with hope and a little dread, since nothing teaches you the weight of your own time like waiting for someone to decide whether your hours deserve payment. When my brother finally visited, it was during fall of my junior year, and he arrived in a tailored coat he made sure to remove with ceremony, letting it drape over my dorm chair as if the particle board might learn manners from the wool. And he looked around at the taped mood boards, the clipped proofs, the battered cutting mat, and said, with genuine curiosity disguised as charm, that the place felt artsy, which I translated as messy, and then he mentioned he was building a personal site to impress partners at his firm, and asked whether I could throw something together for him by Monday, preferably free, because family is family and exposure is priceless. I smiled tightly and told him I would be thrilled to help, then stayed up 2 nights making a clean, painfully elegant single-page portfolio with crisp headshots, balanced copy, and a quiet interaction design that would flatter even the most inflated resume. And when I sent him the staging link on Sunday morning, I attached an invoice with my full rate, not discounted by a cent, and I made the billable line read family rate, market value, paid on time, because sometimes revenge is not a slammed door or a shouted truth, but a tidy document that reframes the lie you were fed and returns it, laminated, to the original sender. He called me an hour later, chuckled in the way men do when they think a woman is testing a boundary they can afford to ignore, and asked whether I was serious. I told him I absolutely was. That my landlord and the bursar were both traditionalists who preferred money to exposure, and that if he needed legal copy reviewed someday, I would be sure to recommend him at his full rate as well, which made him quiet long enough for me to enjoy the silence. He paid, perhaps because partners were watching or because his pride could not bear to let me play creditor, and I took that money, every dollar of it, and donated it to a local foundation that funds first-generation women in design. A decision I made while remembering the dinner where my brother's laptop glowed like a moon over roast chicken and my dreams were treated like napkin rings, and I forwarded the donation receipt to my mother with a short note that said I had finally learned how family contributions work, and that mine would always find their way to daughters who had been told there was no money for their education, which earned me a message back full of hurt and confusion and a line about how I was misunderstanding their sacrifices. A claim I chose not to answer because truth has a way of needing no defense when the ledger is clear. Around the same time, a professor who liked the way I made ugly data look human pushed me to submit a series of interface mock-ups to a national student competition I had never heard of, and I almost didn't. Because working-class habits train you to distrust lotteries you cannot rig with sweat, yet I sent the files at midnight after my shift and forgot about them. Until a month later when an email with a subject line too formal to be spam slid into my inbox and informed me that I had won the whole thing, along with a stipend and a summer placement at a small but hungry startup that needed a designer yesterday and offered equity instead of comfort, which sounded suspicious to the part of me that craved stability, but irresistible to the part that had learned to build something from found parts and a deadline. I closed my laptop, walked across campus with the winter air flaying my cheeks, and thought about how debts can travel through families like heirlooms, then decided that mine would stop with me, which is why, when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother asking whether I might come home for Easter because it would mean a lot to your brother if you could help him prepare for a big presentation, I typed a reply that said I was honored, that I would absolutely love to help, and that I would send my consulting agreement in the morning along with my travel rate, a message so politely ruthless it tasted like mint, and as I pressed send, the streetlight above me flickered, a single bright pulse that felt almost like applause. And then my phone chimed again with a new email from the startup's founder asking whether I could meet that week to discuss a role that might change the shape of everything I thought stability looked like. The startup that pulled me in with a stipend and a promise of equity turned out to be the kind of place where coffee was rationed like gasoline during a storm and ideas were thrown against the wall with enough force to see what survived. And while half the team wore hoodies and the other half pretended not to notice their rent due dates approaching like slow trains, I realized that my stubbornness had finally found a room where it was not an inconvenience but a fuel, because when I took our mess of a product and sketched an interface that treated overwhelmed users like humans instead of lab rats, people stopped arguing about features and started talking about how it felt, which is the first sign you have made something breathe. The founder, who spoke in a steady hum like a refrigerator that never slept, asked me to stay through the summer and then through the fall, and I said yes, because it felt good to build a thing whose success could not be mistaken for a favor, and because the city had begun to fit my feet like a pair of boots that once blistered and now carried me everywhere without complaint. Classes continued, as they do when the bursar is satisfied and your professors sense a current they would rather guide than resist, and I balanced studio critiques with stakeholder meetings that smelled faintly of takeout and anxious ambition. Then walked home past windows where other people's dinners looked golden and generous, and I allowed myself a wry smile at the old story I kept telling myself about scarcity, because there is a difference between not having and not being given, and the moment you understand that difference you start renegotiating your ghosts. News of our product's first contract landed on a gray morning that still tasted like toothpaste, and I forwarded the email to no one, not because I lacked people to tell, but because I had learned to distrust applause that arrives only after the heavy lifting is done. My mother discovered my updated resume the way mothers stumble into anything digital, through a friend of a friend who had a daughter in the city and a habit of sending links like they were casseroles, and suddenly my phone filled with sticky warmth. Questions about my apartment and my creative director, title, and whether the company offered health insurance, then a careful pivot into the real agenda. A note that my brother was having a challenging year at his firm and might benefit from some introductions if I happen to know any startups looking for legal counsel, and I could feel the old bruise forming in the exact same spot where no money had once been pressed, so I thanked her for thinking of me, told her I was excited for what came next, and ignored the implication that my progress was meaningful chiefly as a bridge to my brother's comfort. A week later, right on cue, my brother called with a voice he saved for clients who were not yet expensive, and he made small talk about the weather before asking whether I could slip his firm into our next fundraising conversation. Because their partners specialized in early-stage companies and had a package that would take pressure off the creative folks, which sounded suspiciously like a man explaining seatbelts to an engineer, and I let him finish his polished pitch before saying I appreciated the thought and would send along a few options, which I did, only the list did not include his firm. Because the startup had asked me privately for counsel recommendations and I had already spoken to a woman I admired who built a boutique practice around founders who grew up counting tips and dodging predatory clauses that wealthy cousins called standard. And when I introduced her to our team, the conversation felt like sunlight after a string of buzzing fluorescents, and within 2 days, we had an agreement that respected our runway and our paranoia, and I sat very still after the documents went through. Because sometimes revenge is not a door slammed in a face, but a door held open for someone else, while you watch the face in the hallway realize the room will never again be arranged for him. My father wrote next, a tidy email dressed as concern that never quite disguised the accounting underneath, and he mentioned that my brother had been working late nights to keep important clients happy, then asked with surprising bluntness whether I could loop him in with our general counsel, and I read the message twice in the glow of the screen and remembered that dinner toast about how when it is your child's future you find a way, and I decided to answer with the exact measure of courtesy owed to people who taught you the price of your own name, so I wrote that our counsel had been selected through a competitive process, and it would be unprofessional to revisit the decision, then added that I was not in the business of hiring lawyers anyway, which is the moment my brother called again, hot voice and careful words, accusing me of confusing family with a resume cue, and I told him that I had finally learned the family policy by heart, and it read very clearly that resources are allocated where return is expected, which he called petty until I mentioned my rate sheet and the donation receipt I had sent to our mother, at which point he hung up because dignity often hates paperwork. The petty part of me wanted to send him the press release announcing our partnership with the boutique firm, along with the photo of their founding partners shaking hands with our team while the caption praised shared values and first-generation excellence. Yet restraint is also a kind of blade, so I forwarded the release instead to a list of women I had mentored through the foundation, added a note about asking hard questions before signing anything, and then I walked to the corner bodega, where the owner kept a jar of candy by the register, bought a chocolate that tasted like childhood done correctly, and came home to a voicemail from my mother layered with breathy disappointment about how I had become hard, which I suppose was true in the way ice is truthful about water. That night the founder called to say that our next milestone would put us on stage in front of investors who preferred confident stories to hedge-filled monologues, and he asked whether I would present the product, not as a designer hiding behind screenshots, but as the person who had made its spine hold up under pressure, and I said I would because the stage had been denied to me often enough that I had stopped fearing it. Then I opened my laptop to an email from my father that ended with a line so naked I almost respected it, a suggestion that if I cared about family I would step in now before my brother's numbers slipped beyond recovery, and I wrote back a single sentence that tasted like clean steel, that I was not hiring lawyers. And I hit send before I could tidy it further, which is when my phone buzzed again with a text I had not expected, an invitation to come home for the holidays because it would be good for all of us to reset, a phrase that felt less like peace and more like a trap hidden under a tablecloth, and I stared at the message until the screen dimmed and then brightened again, already picturing the long table, the careful smiles, and the little war everyone thought I was too polite to win. The first time I walked back into my parents' house after years of absence, it felt like stepping into a photograph where every shadow had been meticulously arranged to make the past look softer than it had been. And yet I could feel it pressing against me as soon as I crossed the threshold, the polished floors reflecting my shoes in a way that reminded me how long it had been since I cared whether anyone noticed my presence or not. The smell of roasting chicken and simmering vegetables filled the air, the same smell that had once meant home, but now smelled like a staged production meant to impress, and I realized immediately that my family's return invitations were not casual. They were calculated, designed to assess, to probe, to see whether the daughter who had left their rules behind could now be leaned on for convenience. My mother greeted me with a hug that was both warm and wary, her eyes flicking to my briefcase and laptop bag as if she were measuring what I had become and whether it could be repurposed for their needs, and my father, as always, shook my hand with a polite firmness that concealed his calculation, the kind of handshake that can either close a deal or signal the absence of leverage. Dinner was an exercise in nostalgia and theater, with every dish plated to appear effortless and familiar, yet every gesture and compliment felt hollow, rehearsed, and intended to draw me into the role of a daughter who was willing to overlook years of disparity, who might forget the whispered words about no money and the celebrations for my brother that had been denied to me. I listened as my brother, confident and polished, described his latest cases, his promotions, and his firm's minor successes, narrating them as though each sentence were a reminder of their investment in him, while I responded with neutral curiosity, letting my silence stretch between his words, a subtle counterweight to the stories that had always placed him at the center and me in the background. My mother leaned in to ask about my work, and I spoke carefully, aware that honesty would be perceived as arrogance or defiance if it carried too much detail about the projects that were now giving me freedom and influence, and I let her think she understood, while knowing that she had only glimpsed the surface of the life I had built without her assistance. Later, while the wine glinted in crystal glasses and the conversation softened into idle family stories, my mother made a remark so casually dangerous that I almost laughed, realizing too late that it was both a confession and an invitation. Your brother's firm is struggling a little, and if we can't help him, we might lose the house. The words fell like polished stones into a still pond, and I felt the ripple of clarity spread across the surface of my memory, connecting all the dots of childhood lessons about scarcity, favoritism, and my parents' selective generosity. And I understood in that moment that their interest in me had nothing to do with reunion or reconciliation, but entirely with what they imagined I could provide. I sipped my water and smiled politely, letting my attention wander to the candlelight flickering over the tablecloth, because when you have learned the weight of self-reliance, every request for intervention from those who withheld support in the past feels like a hand extended not in trust, but in calculation. That night, back in the guest room, I opened my laptop and began drafting the plans I had been considering quietly for months. The financial maneuvers that would secure my independence and allow me to observe the consequences of their choices without interference, and I smiled at the irony that the power I had sought all these years had arrived in the form of a balance sheet, a series of legal instruments, and a network of allies I had cultivated far from the kitchens where my dreams were. Dismissed. I received a text from my brother shortly after midnight, a message dripping with misplaced familiarity and casual arrogance. Thanks for dinner. You've really changed, and I stared at it for a long moment, weighing the truth of my transformation against the perception they held, and typed back simply, not as much as I will, knowing that the real change was neither visible nor immediate, but inevitable, and that the next moves would be mine to orchestrate entirely. The air was heavy with anticipation and a subtle, unspoken tension, the kind that grows when people believe they control the narrative but have no understanding of the depth of patience and strategy that one person can cultivate in the years of absence. And I felt a quiet satisfaction in the realization that for the first time, I was not playing by their rules, that the table was no longer tilted in favor of the entitled, and that I could allow them to continue thinking that their leverage remained intact while I arranged a future in which it was utterly irrelevant. I lay awake listening to the distant hum of the streetlights outside, the faint murmur of cars that no longer seemed to intrude, and I allowed myself a thought that had been forbidden for so long, that revenge need not be immediate, loud, or angry to be complete, and that the elegance of silence and calculated distance could inflict consequences more precise and enduring than confrontation ever could. By the time dawn crept across the horizon and the first light cut through the curtains, I had drawn the outlines of my plan in sharp, deliberate lines that mirrored the work I had done for clients who trusted me with their reputations. And I felt a rare and profound clarity, knowing that the coming weeks would be decisive, that my choices would speak louder than explanations, and that the long-delayed justice I had imagined so many nights before was finally within reach, poised to unfold. Quietly, irrevocably, and on terms that belonged entirely to me. The weeks that followed my return to the city after that carefully calculated dinner felt like walking through a fog that was slowly lifting, revealing the edges of every decision I had postponed. The choices I had measured and layered in silence until the moment when action could be both deliberate and invisible, because I had long learned that the most satisfying victories are those that arrive quietly, without applause, and leave those who once underestimated you scrambling to understand. What had changed? I opened my accounts, reviewed the balance sheets, and traced every connection I had cultivated over the years, each partnership, each referral, each donation made on behalf of girls who had been told there was no money for their education. And I realized that the power I had amassed was sufficient to create consequences as precise and unassailable as any court judgment, consequences that could unfold without me ever having to raise my voice, because influence built on competence is sharper than the loudest confrontation and lasts far longer than anger. I chose to begin with the mortgage on my parents' house, a property that had always been a symbol of selective generosity. The place where my brother had celebrated achievements I had been denied and where my absence had been treated as a minor inconvenience rather than the absence of an equal, and I purchased the debt anonymously through a third-party trust, careful to ensure that my identity would remain hidden, knowing that the moment they discovered the arrangement would arrive at the perfect intersection of confusion and inevitability, because subtlety in execution is as much an art as the work that built my career, and I had learned to value precision over theatrics. When the foreclosure notice eventually arrived, addressed to the familiar names that had once dictated the boundaries of my opportunity, I waited to see how the consequences of their previous choices would unfold without my intervention, letting time, as it often does, reveal the weight of past actions in ways no lecture could convey, and I imagined my mother's first reaction as she read the notice, the disbelief, the frantic calculation, and the dawning horror that resources can vanish quietly, without argument or announcement, leaving only the stark reflection of prior decisions. The first call came late in the evening, a shaky voice on the line that I recognized immediately, the one I had memorized over years of careful observation and selective engagement, and when she said, "Please, you could help us," I answered with the calm, unflinching tone that had been honed through countless negotiations and firm refusals, "There's no money," and held the line long enough to let the words resonate without apology, because silence following truth can be more devastating than any explanation, and because the kind of satisfaction I sought was not in seeing tears or hearing protests, but in observing the clarity of consequence meet the reality of choices that had been made decades before. I did not stop there, because revenge in my hands was not about harm but about the careful redistribution of opportunity, and I arranged, through the foundation I had founded with my early earnings and scholarship winnings, anonymous contributions to educational programs for young women whose families had refused or failed to support them. The same principle applied in reverse. Resources channeled not to those who demanded entitlement, but to those who would transform them into self-reliance, creativity, and independence, so that each act, each donation, each scholarship granted carried within it the echo of lessons learned, quietly correcting the imbalance I had endured without ever needing to claim the recognition or gratitude for the action. Weeks turned into months, and the house remained unsold, foreclosures delayed, Legal notices handled by intermediaries who never revealed my involvement, and I watched from the distance of my new office. The skyline spread before me like a canvas. A life meticulously assembled from effort, patience, and careful judgment, knowing that the balance of power had shifted, not through confrontation or spectacle, but through competence and deliberate choices, each one reinforcing the truth I had lived for so long, that independence is its own form of justice, and that the leverage of those who denied you can only exist as long as you allow it. The last message came, unexpectedly, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, a note from my mother about a hospital bill, phrased in the same soft, pleading tone that had opened so many previous conversations, and I read it slowly, letting each word sink before responding with the same calm detachment that had defined every interaction since I had returned. "Tell my brother I said hi," I wrote, and then closed the laptop, allowing the silence that followed to speak louder than any words. The quiet authority of someone who had survived, thrived, and orchestrated consequences without spectacle, leaving those who had underestimated her to confront only the inevitability of the life she had built on her own terms, a life unclaimed by obligation, unshaken by past injustices, and balanced by a satisfaction that was both complete and serene, because true revenge, I had learned, is not in destruction, but in the quiet reclamation of your own worth.